What if the happiness you're seeking was precisely in accepting the hardest truths of your life? Imagine for a moment a man who had everything: fortune, recognition, power. From the outside, his life seemed perfect. But inside him, something was silently crumbling every day. Because there was a truth he refused to accept, a reality he avoided with every fiber of his being. Could it be that what we most fear to face is precisely what we most need to accept to find inner peace? This is the story of a millionaire who discovered that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the capacity to look at yourself in the mirror and accept what you see. A story of personal transformation that will make you question everything you thought you knew about happiness. Are you prepared to confront your own truths? Marcus was 43 years old when his world collapsed. Not from a financial crisis, not from a love betrayal, but from something much more devastating: the encounter with himself. Sitting in his office on the 40th floor, contemplating the city that seemed to surrender at his feet, he realized something that chilled his blood. He didn't recognize himself. The man in the window's reflection was a stranger built upon expectations that were never his own. For decades he had lived pursuing an image. The image of the perfect son his father never was. The image of the ideal husband that media sold. The image of the ruthless businessman that society applauded. But in the process of building those masks, he had lost something fundamental: his essence. That afternoon, after a particularly successful meeting where he had closed a multi-million-dollar deal, Marcus remained alone in the boardroom. His partner's praise still echoed in his ears, but for the first time in years he felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pride, not even relief. Just a deep emptiness that scared him more than any financial loss. He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. Below, thousands of people ran from one place to another, each pursuing their own version of success. How many of them felt like him? How many had built lives that others admired but they themselves didn't recognize? The night before he had had a recurring nightmare. He was at his own funeral, observing from outside as people talked about him. All the words were correct: successful, determined, prosperous. But no one spoke of who he really was because no one really knew him. Not even himself. Marcus remembered the exact moment when this performance had begun. He was 8 years old and his father had arrived drunk to his soccer game. While other fathers shouted words of encouragement, his shouted criticism. "You're not strong enough. You'll never amount to anything like this." That night, Marcus had made a decision that would mark the next 35 years of his life. He would be so successful that no one, especially his father, could ever criticize him. But now, decades later, he realized he had been living to silence the voice of a man who had died 5 years earlier. He had built an empire not out of love for work, but out of fear of failure. He had accumulated wealth not for security, but for validation. He had created an image of perfection not out of authenticity, but for emotional survival. Stoicism teaches that suffering is born from the gap between our expectations and reality. Marcus had spent years creating unrealistic expectations about who he should be, instead of accepting who he really was. His inner strength had weakened because he had spent it maintaining a facade. The first hard truth he had to accept: you are not who you think you should be. You are who you are, and that's okay. This revelation didn't come as a ray of light. It came as an avalanche of darkness. Because accepting this truth meant dismantling the entire structure of his constructed identity. It meant recognizing that he had lived a lie, not out of malice but out of fear. Fear of disappointment. Fear of judgment. Fear of not being enough. But Marcus began to understand something that would change his life forever. True emotional independence is not found in being who others expect, but in having the courage to be authentically oneself. That night, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. Not tears of sadness but of relief. The relief of letting go of the crushing weight of others' expectations. The relief of beginning the journey toward his true self. Emotional management isn't about suppressing emotions, it's about understanding them and channeling them toward our growth. Marcus was learning that each tear was a step toward his liberation. How much time have you invested trying to be who others expect you to be, instead of discovering who you really are? The following days were a whirlwind of questioning. Marcus found himself analyzing every decision of his adult life. Had he chosen his career out of passion or prestige? Had he built his fortune out of necessity or recognition? Had he formed his family out of love or to fulfill a social script? The answer hit him like a punch to the stomach. He had lived his entire life seeking external applause, constant validation, approval from others. His self-esteem depended on numbers in bank accounts, titles on the wall, praise in business meetings. One morning, while preparing for another board meeting, Marcus stopped in front of the bathroom mirror. The perfect suit, the Italian silk tie, the watch that cost more than most people's cars. Everything calculated to project success, power, control. But who was he underneath all that? He remembered the time his 12-year-old son had asked him, "Dad, why do you always work?" And his automatic response had been, "To give you a good life." But the truth, which now hit him with brutal force, was different. He worked compulsively because his identity depended on external achievements. He couldn't stop because he didn't know who he was without his professional titles. The crisis came during a gala dinner where he was being honored as Businessman of the Year. As he walked up to the stage to receive the award, he felt a total disconnection from the moment. It was as if he were watching someone else receive recognition for a life that wasn't his. During his acceptance speech, Marcus experienced something he had never felt. A profound sadness for the man he had stopped being to become who he thought he should be. The words came out of his mouth automatically, thanking his team, his family, the organizers. But inside, a voice was screaming at him, "This isn't you. This isn't your life." That night, he came home and found his wife reading in the living room. She looked up and smiled at him. "How was your big night?" she asked. Marcus sat next to her and for the first time in years, told her the truth. "I don't know. I think I was there, but I wasn't really there." His wife put the book aside and looked at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. "Marcus, I've been waiting for you to say something like this for years." That conversation extended until the early hours of dawn. Marcus discovered that his wife had noticed his disconnection long before he had. She had seen how he had become progressively more successful and progressively less happy. She had observed how each achievement, instead of satisfying him, only increased his need for the next one. "It's like you're addicted to approval," she told him gently. "And like any addiction, each time you need more to feel the same thing." The Stoic world taught him that this dependence was his golden prison. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The opinion of others cannot harm you unless you allow it to." But Marcus had built his entire identity on the quicksand of others' opinions. The second hard truth: your worth doesn't depend on what others think of you. This understanding was devastating because it implied that much of his achievements had been motivated by wrong reasons. He hadn't built a business empire out of satisfaction from work well done, but out of desperate need to prove his worth to an absent father who would never come to see it. Genuine resilience is born when you stop needing others to validate your existence. Marcus began to practice a daily exercise, making decisions based solely on his internal values, not on how they would be perceived by others. First, they were small decisions. Saying no to social invitations that didn't interest him. Rejecting business opportunities that didn't align with his principles. Expressing unpopular opinions when he believed they were correct. Each small act of authenticity was like lifting weights for his soul. His inner strength grew not because he was doing heroic things, but because he was finally living according to his truth. Self-discipline isn't just about getting up early or exercising. True self-discipline is the ability to live according to your values, even when the world tries to push you in another direction. Marcus discovered that the deepest personal transformation occurs when you stop being a slave to others' expectations and become the architect of your own life. How many of your decisions are based on what you really want, and how many on what you think others expect of you? 3 months after his revelation, Marcus faced his greatest test. His father, the same man whose approval he had pursued his entire life, died suddenly of a heart attack. And at the funeral, while watching the coffin descend, he realized something that broke his soul. There would never be that conversation he had been waiting for. He would never hear the words, "I'm proud of you," come from those lips. The third hard truth: some wounds will never heal, some conversations will never happen, some closures will never come. And that's okay. His father's death hadn't been just the loss of a person. It had been the death of a hope that had kept him functioning for decades. Marcus had realized he had been living an entire life based on a moment that would never come. The days following the funeral were the darkest of his life. Not from traditional grief pain, but because he faced a devastating truth. He had wasted 43 years waiting for validation from someone who never had the emotional capacity to give it to him. His father had been a broken man, raised by another broken man, in a generational chain of emotional deficiencies that Marcus had perpetuated without realizing it. But now, instead of continuing that chain, he had the opportunity to break it. A week after the funeral, Marcus found an old diary among his father's belongings. With trembling hands, he opened it and began to read. The pages revealed a man tormented by his own insecurities, by his inability to express love, by the fear of not being enough for his family. In a particularly heartbreaking entry, his father had written, I saw Marcus at his graduation today. I was so proud I couldn't speak. I don't know why I can't tell him these things. Every time I try, the words get stuck. I hope someday he knows how much I love him." Marcus cried for hours. Not tears of sadness, but of liberation. His father had loved him. Not in the way he had needed, not in the way he had been able to understand, but he had loved him in his imperfect way. This revelation didn't erase the pain of decades of seeking approval, but it transformed it. Marcus began to understand that radical acceptance doesn't mean justifying the harm caused by others, but freeing oneself from the need for that harm to define the rest of one's life. He began to practice a daily exercise he called the acceptance inventory. Every morning he wrote one thing he couldn't change and needed to accept completely. He started with simple things: I can't change my height. I can't make my father have been different. I can't control the weather. Gradually the exercise became deeper. I can't make everyone approve of me. I can't guarantee my children won't make mistakes. I can't prevent the people I love from eventually dying. Each acceptance was like letting go of a burden he had been carrying without realizing it. Marcus discovered he had been spending enormous amounts of emotional energy trying to change things that were beyond his control, while neglecting the things he could change. His thoughts, his reactions, his decisions. This was the essence of radical acceptance that Stoicism preaches. It's not about passively resigning oneself, but about completely accepting reality as it is, without the filter of how it should be. Marcus had spent 43 years waiting for something that was never going to come. He had built his identity around a void, had defined his success in terms of filling a hole that could never be filled. But instead of sinking into bitterness, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in his life he felt free. Free from that desperate search, free from that constant need to prove something to someone who was no longer there to see it. Emotional control doesn't mean suppressing emotions. It means understanding that some experiences are meant to transform us, not to be overcome. Marcus's pain didn't disappear, but it changed in nature. It became wisdom. Mature emotional management involves developing the capacity to hold pain without being destroyed by it. To allow wounds to teach us without allowing them to define us. Marcus began to practice what Stoics call amor fati, love of fate. Not just accepting what had happened but finding meaning in it. His absent father had taught him, inversely, the importance of being present. His desperate search for approval had shown him the value of self-acceptance. True emotional independence is born when you stop fighting against reality and begin to collaborate with it. That night, he wrote in his diary, "Dad, you never told me you were proud of me. But today I understood that I don't need you to. I'm learning to be proud of myself." What aspects of your past are you still waiting to change instead of accepting them as part of your story? His father's death triggered something unexpected in Marcus's life, a profound desire for solitude. Not the toxic solitude of isolation, but the nourishing solitude of encountering oneself. For years he had filled every free moment with activities, meetings, social commitments. Anything to avoid being alone with his thoughts. But now he understood that this evasion had been a way of running from himself. The fourth hard truth: the person you've been running from the most is yourself. Marcus made a radical decision. He canceled all his non-essential social commitments for a month. His friends thought he was going through a midlife crisis. His business partners assumed he was depressed about his father's death. But the truth was different. For the first time in decades, Marcus wanted to know himself. He began by waking up at 5 in the morning, an hour earlier than usual. That extra hour he didn't dedicate to work or exercise, but to silence. He sat in his study with a cup of coffee and simply existed. No music, no news, no constant noise of productivity. The first days were torturous. His mind was chaos of work worries, anxiety about the future, guilt about the past. But gradually, beneath all that mental noise, he began to hear something that had been silenced for years. His authentic inner voice. This voice wasn't the one that repeated others' expectations or calculated business strategies. It was softer, wiser, more honest. It was the voice that remembered his childhood dreams, that recognized beauty in simple moments, that knew the difference between the important and the urgent. Marcus began to keep a journal of these morning encounters with himself. At first, the entries were simple observations. Today I noticed that birds sing differently when it rains. I realized it's been months since I really saw a sunrise. But over time the reflections became deeper. He wrote about his deepest fears, not the professional ones he shared in executive therapy, but the existential ones he had never admitted. The fear of insignificance. The fear of having wasted his life. The fear of dying without having really lived. One morning, while watching the sunrise light enter through his window, Marcus had a revelation that would change everything. He realized he had been looking for happiness in the wrong places, not because he was stupid, but because he had never learned to be comfortable with his own company. Throughout his adult life, he had defined moments of solitude as unproductive time. Time that should be filled with activities, tasks, distractions. But now he understood that those moments of apparent doing nothing were when the most important connections occurred. The connection with himself. He began to extend these periods of solitude. On weekends, instead of filling his schedule with social activities, he took long walks alone. He walked trails in the nearby mountains, observing how nature existed without need for external validation, without need to impress anyone. During one of these walks, Marcus experienced something he hadn't felt since childhood: pure wonder. He stopped in front of a centuries-old tree and stayed there for 20 minutes, simply observing. He wasn't thinking about business, he wasn't planning his next meeting. He was completely present, completely connected to the moment. That day he wrote in his journal, "Today I remembered what it feels like to be alive without needing to justify my existence." Marcus began to practice what he called dates with myself. Every morning before the world woke up, he sat in silence for an hour. No phone, no music, no distractions. Just him and his thoughts. At first it was uncomfortable. His mind was chaos of worries, plans, memories. But gradually something beautiful began to emerge. His authentic inner voice. Not the voice that repeated others' expectations, but his own inner wisdom. Real personal development doesn't happen in seminars or self-help books. It happens in silent moments when you have the courage to face yourself without disguises. The self-discipline of solitude taught him something fundamental. He didn't need constant company from others to feel complete. His own company, when it was authentic, was enough. This understanding transformed all his relationships. He no longer sought in others what only he could find in himself. He didn't expect his wife to fill the emotional void that only he could fill. He didn't demand from his children the validation that only he could give himself. True emotional independence is born when you discover that the only person you need to be happy is yourself. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or antisocial. It means relating to others from abundance, not from lack. Marcus discovered that when he stopped using relationships as medicine for his wounds, relationships became deeper, more authentic, more satisfying. Self-salvation isn't a heroic act. It's the silent work of learning to be at peace with yourself. In his moments of solitude, Marcus began to develop what Stoics call ataraxia, an inner tranquility that doesn't depend on external circumstances. It wasn't happiness in the emotional sense, but something deeper: peace. When was the last time you were truly alone with yourself, without fleeing toward distractions? 6 months after his father's funeral, Marcus received news that would change his perspective forever. During a routine medical checkup, doctors found something concerning. It wasn't terminal, but it was serious. Enough to remind him that his time in this world was limited. Strangely, this news didn't fill him with panic. It filled him with clarity. The fifth hard truth: you're going to die. And that's what makes life precious. Sitting in the doctor's office, listening to the doctor explain treatment options and probabilities, Marcus experienced something unexpected: a profound sense of relief. Not relief from being sick, but relief from finally facing the reality he had been avoiding his entire life: his mortality. For 43 years he had lived as if he were immortal. He had postponed important conversations for later. He had saved his deepest dreams for when he had time. He had lived as if life were a rehearsal for some main event that never came. But now, confronted with his own finitude, Marcus realized there was no rehearsal. This was life. This was his only chance. The first person he called wasn't his wife or his children. It was his sister, with whom he had had an argument years ago over an issue so trivial he couldn't even remember what it was. They had let pride and stubbornness ruin a relationship that had been important to both. "Sarah," he said when she answered the phone, clearly surprised to hear his voice. "I need to apologize to you. And I need to tell you that I love you." The conversation that followed was one of the most important of his life. Sarah had been waiting for that call for years, but had been too proud to make it herself. Both had lost precious years over something that was resolved in a 30-minute conversation. That night Marcus made a list. Not a to-do list or professional goals, but a list of conversations he had been postponing, of experiences he had been saving for someday, of aspects of himself he had been hiding for fear of judgment. At the top of the list he wrote, "Live as if it were real, because it is." The following days were of an emotional intensity he had never experienced. Marcus began to have conversations he had been avoiding for years. He told his best friend how much his friendship meant. He confessed to his wife fears he had kept to himself. He explained to his children that he had been an imperfect father, but that he loved them perfectly. Each conversation was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Marcus realized he had been living in a prison of his own inhibitions, maintaining a safe distance even from the most important people in his life. He began to review how he had been spending his time. He calculated that in the last 10 years he had spent more hours in work meetings than in meaningful conversations with his family. He had dedicated more energy to impressing strangers than to deeply knowing the people he loved. This revelation didn't fill him with guilt, but with determination. Marcus understood he couldn't change the past, but he could radically change how he lived the present. He made a decision that surprised everyone. He began to delegate more responsibilities at work, not to retire, but to have more time for what really mattered. His partners initially thought he was losing his ambition, but soon realized he had found something more powerful: purpose. Marcus discovered that when you stop living as if you were immortal, every day becomes a gift. Every conversation becomes important. Every moment of beauty becomes sacred. Marcus had spent decades postponing real life for some indefinite future moment. When I have more money, when the kids grow up, when I retire, when everything is perfect. But confrontation with his mortality showed him the illusion of that thinking. Stoics practiced an exercise called memento mori, remembering death. Not as something morbid, but as the purest motivation to live authentically. Because when you know your time is limited, every moment becomes precious, every decision becomes meaningful. Marcus's personal transformation accelerated. He began to eliminate everything that wasn't essential from his life. Businesses that didn't passion him. Superficial relationships that drained his energy. Commitments he had acquired out of social obligation. It wasn't cruelty, it was love. Love for his limited time, love for the people who really mattered, love for the life he was finally starting to live. True inner strength isn't measured by how much you can carry, but by your wisdom to let go of what you don't need to carry. Marcus discovered that the deepest emotional management comes from understanding that you don't have time for emotions that don't serve you. Chronic resentment, anxiety about hypothetical futures, guilt about immutable pasts, all of that became luxury he couldn't afford. Self-discipline took on new meaning. It was no longer about forcing himself to do things he hated for some future benefit. It was about having the discipline to live according to his deepest values, now, today, in this moment. He began writing letters to his children that they would read after his death. Not morbid letters, but letters full of wisdom, love, and the lessons he had learned too late. Each letter was an act of love, but also an exercise in clarity about what really mattered. The ultimate emotional control is developing the capacity to live as if each day were important, because it is. What would you change in your life if you knew you had limited time to live it? The medical diagnosis brought with it a decision Marcus never thought he would make. He decided to be completely honest with the most important people in his life. Not superficial honesty, but radical vulnerability. He began with his wife. One night after dinner, he told her everything. The insecurities he had hidden, the fears he had silenced, the masks he had used even with her. He spoke to her about his father, about his desperate search for approval, about how he had built his identity on fragile foundations. The sixth hard truth: true intimacy is only possible when you have the courage to be completely seen. The conversation lasted until the early hours of the morning. Marcus spoke of things he had never verbalized, not even to himself. He told her about the nights he had spent awake, terrified of not being enough. He confessed that for years he had felt as if he were acting the role of his own life. "I've been married to you for 15 years, he told his wife, "but only now am I showing you who I really am." Sarah's reaction surprised him completely. Instead of shock or disappointment, he saw relief in her eyes. Tears of recognition, not sadness. "Marcus," she said, taking his hands, "I've been waiting to meet this person for all these years. I knew there was more, but I didn't know how to reach you." Sarah confessed that she too had been acting, that she had tried to be the perfect wife of the successful businessman, when in reality there were parts of herself she had been hiding for fear of not meeting expectations. That night marked the beginning of a new relationship, not just between them but of them with themselves. For the first time in years, they stayed awake talking not about family logistics or business plans, but about dreams, fears, hopes, and deep truths. The transformation extended to his relationship with his children. Marcus had been a physically present but emotionally absent father. He had provided everything material they needed, but had been stingy with his vulnerability. One afternoon, his 17-year-old son came home visibly upset about something that had happened at school. Normally, Marcus would have offered practical advice or minimized the problem with phrases like, "This too shall pass." But this time he did something different. "Tell me what happened," he said, "and let me just listen." For the first time his son opened up completely. He spoke about social pressures, about the anxiety he felt about the future, about how sometimes he felt lost and confused. When he finished, Marcus didn't offer solutions. Instead, he shared his own experience. "You know what?" he said, "I felt like that at your age too. And if I'm honest, sometimes I still feel like that." His son's face changed completely. It was as if he had seen his father as human for the first time. "Really? You get scared sometimes too?" Marcus nodded. "All the time. But I've learned that it's okay to be scared. What's not okay is pretending you're not." That conversation opened a door that had been closed for years. His children began to approach him not just when they needed money or permissions, but when they needed genuine understanding. At work, Marcus also began to apply this new authenticity. During a particularly tense meeting, instead of projecting total confidence as he always had, he admitted something revolutionary. "Honestly, I'm not sure what the best decision is here. What do you think?" The effect was immediate. His employees, who had been waiting for him to have all the answers, felt liberated to contribute genuine ideas. The company's dynamic changed from a hierarchy based on unquestionable authority to a collaboration based on mutual honesty. The reaction of his wife surprised him. Instead of shock or disappointment, he found relief in her eyes. "I always knew there was more," she told him. "But I never knew how to reach that part of you." Marcus realized that by trying to protect others from his imperfection, he had actually deprived them of knowing his true essence. He had offered edited versions of himself, believing that was what they wanted, when in reality they yearned for authenticity. Real resilience isn't built by being invulnerable. It's built by being vulnerable in a conscious and brave way. Sharing our wounds doesn't make us weak, it makes us human. With his teenage children, the conversations were different but equally transformative. He spoke to them about his mistakes, his regrets, the lessons he had learned at the cost of years of unnecessary suffering. "You don't need to be perfect," he told them. "You need to be authentic. And authenticity includes mistakes, doubts, imperfections. True emotional independence includes the capacity to be interdependent in a healthy way." Marcus discovered that when he stopped pretending to have all the answers, people began to get closer to him. His employees started sharing ideas they had previously kept out of fear. His friends began to have deeper conversations than weather and sports. The self-discipline of vulnerability required more courage than any business achievement he had reached, because it implied letting go of control over how others perceived him and trusting that his true self was enough. The deepest personal development occurs when you stop using perfection as armor and begin using authenticity as a bridge. In his business meetings, he began to admit when he didn't know something. Instead of weakening his position, this generated more respect and trust. People began to see in him a genuine leader, not just a successful facade. What parts of yourself have you been hiding for fear of not being accepted? 12 months after his awakening, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He began to give away his fortune. Not all of it, but a significant part. Not out of guilt or moral obligation, but because he had discovered something that changed his relationship with money forever. The seventh hard truth: true wealth isn't measured by what you have, but by how little you need to be happy. For years he had accumulated possessions as a way to fill the inner void. Each new acquisition promised to be the one that would finally make him feel complete. But none succeeded, because he was trying to fill an emotional hole with material objects. The Stoic world taught him that authentic happiness comes from inner wealth, not outer. Marcus Aurelius was literally the most powerful man in the world in his time, but wrote about the importance of finding satisfaction in the simple, in the essential. Marcus began to practice what he called emotional minimalism. Just as he had simplified his possessions, he began to simplify his desires. Instead of pursuing more, he focused on appreciating what he already had. This wasn't a practice of deprivation, but of abundance. When you stop constantly needing more, you discover that what you have is already enough. When you stop comparing your life to others, your own life becomes extraordinary. The most sophisticated emotional management is developing the capacity to find wealth in simplicity. Marcus discovered that true security didn't come from having enough money for any emergency, but from knowing that he could handle any emergency, regardless of his material resources. Self-confidence had become more valuable than any bank account. Personal transformation led him to completely redefine success. It was no longer about accumulating more, but about being more. It wasn't about having more power over others, but about having more power over himself. His employees noticed the change. He was no longer the boss who needed to control every detail out of insecurity. He was the leader who trusted his team because he trusted himself. His decisions became more accurate because they came from inner clarity, not from fear or the need to impress. The ultimate emotional control is not needing to control anything external to feel at peace internally. Self-discipline took its purest form, the discipline of being satisfied with enough. Not settling for less than he deserved, but also not needing more than he really needed. Marcus realized he had been chasing a mirage for decades. He had believed that happiness was in the next achievement, the next acquisition, the next level of success. But happiness had been available all along, in the capacity to appreciate the present moment. How much of what you pursue is really necessary for your happiness, and how much is just noise? 2 years after his awakening, Marcus found himself in a place he had never imagined. Not in terms of geographical location, but in terms of inner peace. He had built what Stoics call an inner citadel, a refuge of tranquility that no external circumstance could alter. His health had improved with treatment, but more importantly, his relationship with uncertainty had changed completely. He no longer saw the unknown future as a threat, but as an adventure. The eighth and final hard truth: happiness isn't a destination you arrive at, but a way of traveling. Marcus had spent most of his life waiting for the perfect moment, ideal circumstances, the improved version of himself. But he had discovered that perfection was the enemy of happiness. Not because perfection was bad, but because waiting for it had robbed him of the ability to enjoy the imperfect present. True emotional independence doesn't mean not needing anything or anyone. It means not needing things to be different from how they are to be at peace. It's the capacity to find serenity in the midst of chaos, clarity in the midst of confusion, love in the midst of pain. His company had prospered in ways he had never imagined. But not because he was working harder, but because he was working from a different place. His decisions came from wisdom, not fear. His leadership came from authenticity, not the need to impress. The most powerful inner strength is the one that doesn't need to demonstrate its power. Marcus began to teach what he had learned. Not as a guru with all the answers, but as a fellow traveler who had found some useful shortcuts. He wrote, spoke, shared his story not to be admired but to be useful. He discovered that self-salvation has a domino effect. When a person frees themselves from their own emotional chains, they naturally inspire others to do the same. Not by preaching but by example. His children, now young adults, told him something that became his greatest pride. "Dad, you taught us that it's okay to be imperfect, that it's okay to struggle, that it's okay not to have all the answers. But you also taught us that we can always choose how to respond to life." Real personal development isn't about becoming someone different. It's about becoming who you always were, but with the courage to show it. Emotional management had become as natural as breathing. Not because he no longer felt difficult emotions, but because he had developed the wisdom to navigate through them without being dragged by them. Marcus realized he had found something he had been looking for his entire life without knowing it. The capacity to be completely himself, without apologies, without masks, without the constant need for external validation. True success isn't measured by what you achieve, but by who you become in the process of achieving it. His legacy wouldn't be the buildings he had constructed or the companies he had founded. His legacy would be the lives he had touched with his authenticity, the people he had inspired to be brave with their own vulnerability. The final resilience had arrived, the capacity to face anything life put in front of him, not because he was invincible, but because he had learned that he was stronger than anything that could happen to him. Marcus had found happiness, but not where he had been looking. He had found it in accepting hard truths, in the courage to be vulnerable, in the wisdom to let go of what he couldn't control. Are you ready to accept your own hard truths and begin your own journey toward authentic happiness? Marcus's story isn't unique. It's the story of anyone who has the courage to stop running from themselves and begin the journey toward authenticity. It's the story of those who discover that true strength isn't in being perfect, but in being real. Stoicism isn't a cold and detached philosophy. It's an invitation to live with more depth, more meaning, more peace. It's the recognition that we have much more control over our lives than we believe, and much less control than we would like. Real personal transformation doesn't require extraordinary circumstances. It requires ordinary decisions made with extraordinary consciousness. It requires the courage to look at yourself in the mirror and accept both the light and shadow you see. Your awakening story is waiting to be written. The question isn't whether you have what it takes to change. The question is whether you have the courage to begin. Folded hands if you felt this content touched something inside you. Give the video a like, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who also needs to hear this. Writing hand, leave in the comments, what truth did you accept that changed your life? This helps the channel continue to exist, and you help other people be reborn in silence.